This is Jamie from Stonemaier Games, and today I'm excited to talk about this topic. This is a topic that came up on the Decision Space podcast when I was there with Brendan and Jake recently. And we were talking about games that give players the satisfaction of taking at least one big turn during the game. Whether you're building up to that turn at the end of the game, or maybe it happens somewhere in the middle of the game, or maybe you have a few chances to take one really big, satisfying turn that you've built towards. There are a lot of games that do this in different ways, and today I'm going to talk about 10 different ways that games do this, and my favorite game within each of these subcategories. The first category is Tableau activation. Two examples that I'll mention here before I get to my favorite game are Furnace and Fantastic Factories. In both of those games, you are building tableaus, and then simultaneously with other players, you are activating that full tableau in a way that is really satisfying. You're kind of stringing together, you're getting resources from something, you're putting them into one of the other cards so that they generate resources. In Fantastic Factories, in particular, you're using dice to activate all these different things. And so it's like the entire game is built around one big turn, and that big turn gets bigger and bigger every time you get to take it. So that is very satisfying, I think, in Furnace and Fantastic Factories. But I have to pick, I'm a little biased here, but I'm going to pick our game at Stonemaier Games, Wingspan, as my favorite game in this category of Tableau activation. Because in Wingspan, you're building these rows of cards on your player map. And as you do so, the core strength of each of those actions, there's a core action associated with each of those rows, gets better. And you often have a number of cards with brown activation abilities. These are when activated abilities. And so you're activating each of those cards one by one in those rows, leading to really, really big turns. You may not activate each of those rows many times over the course of the game. Sometimes you will. Sometimes you'll build your entire strategy around activating a row over and over again, but the game is kind of designed to prevent you from doing that too much. We want players to be able to take big turns in Wingspan, but not big turn after big turn after big turn. That kind of minimizes the impact of those big turns. But rather that you build these rows of cards, and every now and then, maybe once or twice over the course of the game, you activate that entire row and get this big satisfaction of doing this thing, then this thing, then this thing. Oh, I think it's 4 or 5 times. 5 times. Actually, 6 times total with the built-in ability. And I think that feels really good in Wingspan, especially since it's not just one tableau, it's 3 different tableaus that you're activating in Wingspan. Not all in the same turn, but you have the option of activating these different tableaus, and I think that's really, really satisfying. So Wingspan is my number 1 pick for big turns in Tableau activation. This next category is a little nebulous, but I'm going to call it ability triggers. With my first example being Seasons. In Seasons, you are creating this big, again, a tableau of cards, but all those cards trigger conditionally. So it's almost like conditional ability triggers. When you do this, you have to activate this and this and this. Seasons is not my top pick for this category because Seasons on the tabletop can be a little difficult to remember all those triggers. But on Board Game Arena, I would say it's one of my favorite heavy games to play on Board Game Arena because Board Game Arena remembers all those triggers for you. It's fantastic to play on Board Game Arena. But my number 1 pick, I would say, in this category is Agricola. Agricola, which is also now on Board Game Arena, but I love the tabletop version. You have all these different buildings and they're called workers or visitors, something like that you're activating over the course of the game, and they activate via triggers. So that they're like, when you do this thing in the game, you activate this card. When you do this, activate this card and this card. And that's combined with Agricola having an accumulation of resources, a category that I'm not even, a subcategory that I'm not going into detail today, but having this, having actions in Agricola, worker placement actions, where they've accumulated a bunch of resources, and you can go and gather those resources for a big turn, like a big fence building turn. And then in addition to that, you have these ability triggers. So it might say like, when you build fences, trigger this and this, or when you build a fence that is this big, trigger this thing. And so many of the cards lead you towards having a big turn or building up until a big turn. And I think that's really, really satisfying in Agricola. The next category is Roll and Write. And 2 of the games that I love in this category are Ganz, Schon, Clever and Rolling Realms, our games. So these are games where they're roll and write games, but they often have like you put one thing down and it triggers something else. In Rolling Realms, the example is that you're writing a dice, you're using a die in one of your realms, and you're getting resources from that realm to use in a different way in one of the other realms. And so it's kind of steamrolling. Every time you put down a die in Rolling Realms, you're moving towards more points and more resources to make that turn feel even bigger and more powerful. Ganz, Schon, Clever does something very similar, where you're maybe triggering an ability in one area of your score sheet in Ganz, Schon, Clever, and that activates another area in the game as well. However, my favorite pick, and I think the game that does this the best in terms of roll and write games, is the Rajas Dice Charmers game. This is a really, really awesome roll and write game where you are, again, similar to these other two games, you're triggering abilities. So you might use a die, select a die and you use it, and that'll let you connect a route just so that you can trigger another ability, and that might let you complete another route to trigger another ability. You end up having these turns where if you look on Yukata.de, where I've played this, where the right sidebar just shows like this series of things that you've activated and gained in the game. And that also means that some of the turns of Rajas Dice Charmers are really short. You might just do one little thing, and that can feel like a little anticlimactic, but it also makes those big turns feel even better. I think that's kind of a key design philosophy for these games with one big turns. Every turn can't be big. Some of the turns need to be short and streamlined so that the playtime doesn't bog down for the other players, and so it feels all that more satisfying when you do have one of those big, very impactful turns. So that's Rajas Dice Charmers as my roll and write pick. Under hand management, so hand management games where we have this deck of cards, this hand of cards that you're using, you're spending these cards at the right time, you're comboing them together, and Keyforge is a game that does this really well. In Keyforge, you're building up a hand of cards, or you're drawing into a hand of cards, and at a certain time you're saying, okay, I want to play this faction. I want to activate this faction this turn. And for Keyforge, that means that you can play any cards from your hand of that faction. There's no other cost. You just get to play them. And you get to activate any cards on the table that you have of that faction. That feels really good. You're kind of building towards these turns that feel really powerful for a specific faction in Keyforge. But even more than that, I think I still prefer Magic the Gathering as a game. I prefer how I just like in Magic. I don't know, a bunch of random cards here that I have from Magic drafts. I love in Magic how you kind of cultivate this combo of cards in your hand and also on the table. It's a combination of the two in Magic that lead to these really big swingy turns. Or maybe you have launch a big attack that you have several cards in hand that you're using for the attack, several creatures in play that you're using for the attack. It's often an attack, but not every turn is that. Sometimes there's another combo that you're working towards in your hand. You're waiting for the right amount of mana to put together these two cards at the right time, or to activate this card in play with the card in your hand. I love those big turns in Magic the Gathering. And they can often even lead to the win, which I'll talk about in a different category below. In the cooperative category, this is a big category, but I wanted to highlight a few cooperative games where big turns are a major feature of the game. One is Gloomhaven Jaws of the Lion. You're comboing together your character's abilities with another character in just the right way, oftentimes with those cards that you need to trash when you use them because they're so powerful. That leads to this really big climactic turn. I love that in Gloomhaven Jaws of the Lion specifically. And also, my top pick for this category is Spirit Island. In Spirit Island, you go for these turns, and this is the thing about cooperative games, you go for these turns where sometimes you feel really, really weak, where you feel like there's no hope, where the game's AI is just going to crush you. And then you have these turns, like in Spirit Island, where you feel super powerful, where suddenly everything is okay because everything just came together. You're using your spirit's ability, you're working together with the other players. In Spirit Island in particular, the game makes you feel more and more powerful as you kind of increase your fear. Or it's not your fear, it's the fear that you're imposing upon the colonists over the course of the game. You get to be more powerful when that happens. And you combine all these things together for these sweeping, powerful turns where you push back the invaders, you push back the colonists, and you push them to the brink, and you're really close to winning at that point, or maybe you do win. Those powerful turns feel really, really good in Spirit Island. I think it's a game that's about giving you that opportunity to have those powerful, sweeping turns. So Spirit Island is my cooperative pick for this category. We're into the bottom 5 here, and these categories are in no particular order. But the next category I have is the end game push. So this is where in a game where the number of points you have matters for the end game trigger. Viticulture is a game of ours, and this was a tough call, but because I love Viticulture, this other game is also really, really good. But in Viticulture, the end game trigger is when you have, a certain number of victory points. that triggers the game for all players. That becomes the final year for all players. And so when you decide to combo together those wine orders and those visitor cards to have a big turn that can potentially trigger the end of the game, that timing really matters. And that building up to that turn feels really, really good. Especially if you're the one to trigger the end of the game, that just feels powerful to do that, even if you don't necessarily end up being the winner of the game. Another game that does that, a more recent game that I love that does that really well, is Dune Imperium. In Dune Imperium, you're always pushing towards 10 victory points. And you might linger behind, you might fall behind a little bit on victory points early in the game, but then the game steers you towards bigger turns based on the different influence tracks that you're working up towards, that you're getting points on them, that you can even take away points from other players. Only one player can have the alliance, I think it's the alliance token for each of those influence tracks. But also, the combat ramps up in Dune Imperium, the benefits from combat. So early in the game, you might have a combat that only gives you like a bunch of spice, or might give you like one influence, maybe a victory point. But late in the game, you can get 2 victory points from a single combat. And there are other ways too. You can buy a Spice Must Flow card. There are all these ways to get victory points. And oftentimes it's nice in Dune Imperium to surprise players by having one really big turn that you've built towards, where this is the turn that you're going to get 3 victory points and reach that 10-point limit to trigger the end of the game, catch the other players off guard. That feels really, really good in Dune Imperium. So I like this idea of having an endgame push where there's a victory point trigger for endgame and you're the one to push to get there with your one big turn. The next category, again, a little nebulous here. I'm going to call it scoring. And this is the one that maybe shouldn't be on this list, but I'll give you some examples so you can see what you think. So some examples of this are in the game Yedo. Yedo is a very mission-driven game where you're building up a bunch of stuff and then going to a certain place or positioning your workers on certain places on the board and then turning in a bunch of that stuff or just showing that you had that stuff to complete a mission. And there are different tiers of missions in the game. So early in the game, you're completing very easy missions. Late in the game, you might go after these, or even early in the game, you might be building towards a really, really difficult mission. And it's a massive turn when you do it because you're putting together all these things that you've spent turn after turn building towards, and the payoff is huge. You're getting a ton of points. You're often getting a ton of other stuff from those missions that feels really, really good. Yedo is very, very satisfying in that way. Some other examples that are a little different are Isle of Skye and my top pick in this category, Cartographers Heroes, because these games are structured around this scoring method where there are 4 different ways that you score in Cartographers, and every round of the game, each of the 4 rounds, you're combining 2 of those scoring methods. So like there's the A and the B category. In the first round, you're combining A and B, and then B and C, and then C and D, and then finally A and D in the final round. And so I love this scoring mechanism because partially because of the variability it adds, and also because it means that new players or players who are re-entering the game can really just focus on A and B early in the game. However, more experienced players will not just focus on A and B, but will also focus on late game scoring. They'll always be building towards these end game scoring categories, which isn't technically a turn in the game, but it kind of feels like it because you are building towards this one big scoring moment in the game at the end of the game. You might do fine with A and B. You might do fine with B and C, but then we get to C and D and A and D, and you've built your map in Cartographers around a huge scoring payoff in those scoring rounds, and that can feel really, really good in Cartographers and also in Isle of Skye. So this kind of building towards a big scoring moment in the game in Yedo, Isle of Skye, and Cartographers, I think is a really, really satisfying way of having one big turn. Next up, we have timing. Like when the timing of what you're doing really matters, when you have timing come together in such a way that it leads to a big turn. First example is Tzolk'in. Tzolk'in is a game about timing. You're putting workers on these gears and choosing when is the right moment to pull these workers off the gears. Because on a pull-off turn, you're typically pulling off, well, you don't have to pull them all off, but typically you're pulling off all of your workers off these gears and getting these benefits. And so you're kind of deciding, okay, do I want to pull them off now or do I want to stall a little bit and wait till the benefits get a little bit better? And then you have this one big turn where you get this big sweeping amount of benefits in Tzolk'in. That can feel really, really good. And that can happen multiple times over the course of the game. It's not just one big turn in Tzolk'in typically. Glenmore 2 is another pick for this category. In Glenmore 2, every time you put down a tile, you're activating every tile around it. So it's a little bit of Tableau building there, but you're also often building towards that one big turn where you're putting down a tile in such a place that you're activating sometimes even 9 tiles, including the tile that you place down, and that can feel really, really good. To have that timing fit together so that you can really maximize all the different abilities on those tiles can feel great. But my pick in this category, again, I'm a little biased, is going to go to Tapestry. Here's the new Tapestry expansion here. Because in Tapestry, the way that I designed the tracks in this game are so that sometimes you moving forward on a track, just because you're farther ahead on that track isn't necessarily a good thing, because many of the tracks look at the other tracks or look at different things that you're trying to do. Many of the tapestry cards look at different things. So you're trying to time it just right so that you can maximize each of those moments in the game when you advance on a certain track in the game. Also, even just the income turns in Tapestry, timing those income turns so that you can really maximize your civs ability, your tapestry card ability, all the tech cards in the game, waiting for the right moment for all those things to go off and give you one big turn in Tapestry due to timing is a huge part of the game. So Tapestry is going to be my pick for timing. 2 more categories left. One is deck building. Deck building games are, they're built around this concept of one big turn. I'm sure you've played a game in Dominion where you or another player has strung together a +1 action, +2 action turns, and so they have this massive turn where they're playing like their entire deck almost. Which, and I want to mention this, can feel really good, but again, it can lead to a lot of downtime for other players. Other players are just kind of sitting there while you're going through your one big turn. It's fine if that happens once, but in Dominion that can happen quite often if you're building an action, a +1 or +2 action-driven deck, which I think is maybe a little bit too much. I think Clank does it a lot better because in Clank you have these big turns, but they don't last forever. Star Realms, you have these turns that feel really, really great. You're doing a ton of damage, you're doing a ton of stuff in these massive damage turns in Star Realms. But even more than Star Realms, I love Shards of Infinity. Shards of Infinity is another game where you lead to these really huge moments, and Shards actually fits into several of these categories. Not only is it a deck building game, but it can kind of lead to these massive turns of damage where you can just win. So it's that same kind of endgame push category. Especially if you go after the shard itself, the mastery mechanism in the game, where you build up to a certain level of mastery and you play a card, you play the infinity shard, and you just instantly win. You do infinite damage. So the game is kind of working you towards that one big turn if you want to go after mastery. You can also just go after damage, and again, the game is working you towards dealing more and more damage on your turn so you can trigger that end game, so you can finally beat your opponent. Or in the cooperative game, when you can finally take out the bad guy. I love the cooperative version of this game. But yeah, deck building games in general, I think, are very good at leading towards these big turns. I think the key, though, is that that a turn doesn't overstay its welcome, and you don't have too many of those big turns. You have escalating turns, but not turn after turn where you're playing through your whole deck and all the other players are sitting around waiting for you to do that. The last category, I'm going to call it Moonshot. So this is moments in games where you just kind of go for it. It's not necessarily a winning moment in the game, but where you build up to a moment where, or a turn where you're kind of putting all your cards on the table, essentially. The classic example of this is Hearts. In Hearts, when you try to shoot the moon. So it's kind of like one big round in Hearts, it's not necessarily one big turn, but because there are many rounds in Hearts, it feels like a turn of the game. In Hearts, when you shoot the moon, you're trying to get all the hearts in rather than give away all the hearts to other players. That can have a really big turn feel to it. In Scythe, my game, Scythe has these moments where you're stringing together a big top row action and a big bottom row action, oftentimes to gain a lot of area control. Sometimes this can trigger the end of the game, or sometimes this can just be because you see the end of the game coming. You see that another player is going to trigger it, and you want to have control as many territories as possible. These big moonshot turns in Scythe. Another interesting game that's very different than these two is Codenames. In Codenames, you can have these turns where you are trying to get a player to guess like 5 different words in one turn, and it can completely turn around the game. If you've just been guessing like 1 or 2 words over the course of Codenames, and suddenly you have this giant turn where you're able to guess a ton of them, that's another moonshot turn, one of these really huge turns in Codenames, and that can feel really, really good. And finally, my top pick in this category is Dice Throne. Dice Throne is a dice dueling asymmetric game where every now and then you can pull off an ultimate ability. This is when you essentially roll all 6s, and maybe you roll a few 6s and you're like, okay, I'm going to try to go for this. And you roll the remaining dice, you get to re-roll them a few times, re-roll them, you get another 6, and then you just go for it. And you hit that moonshot ability, that ultimate ability, where you deal a ton of damage. You do this super powerful thing that just feels amazing. I love that ultimate ability. ability in dice throwing. I love building up towards that with a push your luck element of whether or not you're gonna actually hit it. But it feels so good when you do hit it that I had to put it on this list. I really love Dice Throne's ultimate ability. That's my pick for the one big turns in the Moonshot category. Now, I'm sure I missed a lot of games, maybe some in these categories that I mentioned, maybe even some categories that I didn't think of in games where you get to take that one big turn. And it kind of surprised me that so many Stonemaier games were on this list, because one of the design philosophies for Stonemaier games is that you take really streamlined turns. And so I think there's a nice push and pull here where you can have games that have streamlined turns, even though they also feel really big, rather than having these turns that just take forever and all other players are sitting around waiting for their turn. So I think you can have both. You can have streamlined turns that every now and then are really, really big and powerful. So you can look at Stonemaier games for those examples, or some of the other games on this list. Anyway, I'd love to hear your thoughts on one big turn, games that you like in this category, some of your favorites among the ones that I picked, or some games that I missed. Let me know in the comments below. Thanks.